네, 여러분께서는 2020 코라시아포럼 바이든 시대 아시아 한반도의 미래는 함께 보고 계십니다. 이제 첫 번째 세션을 시작을 하겠는데요. 첫 번째 세션은 새로운 미국, 새로운 세계를 이라는 주제로 다양한 얘기를 나눠보겠습니다. 19차례에 걸친 트럼프 단독 인터뷰를 바탕으로 저서 격노를 발간해서 트럼프 대통령의 코로나19 위험성 축소 은폐 의혹을 폭로하고 또 워터게이트 사건을 보도해서 퓰리처상을 수상하기도 한 전 신 밥 우드워드를 통해서 새로운 미국, 새로운 세계를 이라는 주제로 2020 코라시아 포럼의 첫 순서를 시작을 하겠습니다. 지금부터 소개합니다.
Hello, this is Bob Woodward. I'm talking from Washington, D.C. Glad to be with you. A year ago, my wife Elsa and I visited there for a conference. We visited in Seoul. What a great city and great place. And as we are being totally overwhelmed with the COVID-19 virus in this country, we know what has happened in South Korea, and they're going to write a textbook or many textbooks about how you approached it and managed not only getting control of the virus, but minimizing the impact on your economy. What I want to do is summarize some of the findings when I did the second book, Rage, on the relationships that Trump had in South Korea, his attitudes, and what went on with North Korea. And it really, a central player in all of this was, at the time, the first year of the Trump administration, Secretary of Defense Mattis. And Mattis was assigned to really ramp up the military pressure on North Korea. The overall Trump policy was maximum pressure on North Korea rhetorically, which Trump did joyfully, I believe, calling Kim Jong-un just about everything in the book, including a madman. And the diplomatic pressure was increased, and the military pressure also. But what Mattis did, and this was new in my book, Rage, and something that had not been reported before in any way, that Mattis realized as Secretary of Defense, because of what Kim Jong-un had with nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons that Kim Jong-un had, Mattis was astounded. The numbers were several dozen, and rather ingeniously, Kim Jong-un had hardened and dispersed those weapons and concealed them, so they presented a threat to the whole world in a very real sense, certainly to South Korea. And so Trump was off tweeting and making declarations about the North Korean leader. The fire and fury charges, they were increasing economic sanctions as part of the campaign against North Korea, this pressure campaign. And Mattis realized that even though nuclear weapons were designed as a deterrent and not to be used, that it was always possible because he was assigned the responsibility of protecting the homeland of the United States and also protecting South Korea and Japan. So Mattis, one of the coping mechanisms he had was to go to the National Cathedral here in Washington to pray and reflect on the nature of his responsibility. And he realized that using nuclear weapons would be absolute, utter madness. But because Kim Jong-un was unpredictable and had such an arsenal, he realized he had to think through the possibility, the astonishing weight on his shoulders that he might have to incinerate millions of people. His relationship with President Trump was not very good. He did not get instructions from President Trump. Nuclear weapons could not be used without the president's authority, but Mattis realized in a very, very important way that his recommendation would have weight. And so Mattis would go to the National Cathedral alone in secret and pray, go to the War Memorial Chapel in the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C., and reflect on this. And they had operation plans on the shelf, inconceivable that they would ever have to be used, but you have to wrestle with the inconceivable when you're dealing with somebody like Kim Jong-un and President Trump, who was not involved in the details of this. So on the first demarcation line here is July 3rd, 2017, when Kim launched a ICBM that could reach the United States. That was a moment of great worry in this country, and General Brooks, who was the at the time, the commander in South Korea of the joint U.S.-South Korea forces, wanted to somehow respond to this launching of an ICBM. And so this was not publicized directly, but with the permission of Secretary of Defense Mattis, he launched an Army tactical missile into the sea, but it was sent exactly 186 miles, which if they had swung the missile instead of into the sea up to North Korea, it would have landed at the test site and where Kim was actually watching this missile launch. General Brooks issued a statement that got very little attention, was quite provocative. General Brooks said, "Self-restraint, which is a choice, is also one that separates armistice and war." South Korea also fired a test missile as a warning. Then later in the month, July 28th, Kim Jong-un launched an ICBM that could go 6,200 miles. In other words, it could hit almost anywhere in the United States. Then in September 2017, North Korea tested its 16th, North Korea tested its sixth nuclear weapon, a weapon that was 17 times the power of the atomic bomb that was dropped by the United States in 1945 on Hiroshima in Japan. Trump then ratcheted up further his tweets against Kim Jong-un. It said that Kim Jong-un is obviously a madman, General Brooks and Mattis wanted to increase military pressure on North Korea, and they were getting no response. There was no indication that Kim Jong-un knew that the United States and South Korea were testing these missiles. So on September 25th, there was a simulated attack by South Korean and U.S. Forces, 20 airplanes. They crossed the northern limit line in the sea between North Korea and South Korea, and the planes, including a B-1 bomber, headed toward North Korean territory. They did not overfly North Korea, and the South Korean National Security Council sent a message to the United States that maybe perhaps this is getting too provocative. So the situation was one of economic pressure, military pressure, rhetorical pressure. Then at the end of 2017, President Trump visited South Korea. I describe in some detail how General Brooks described to President Trump, because Trump's position was, oh, we're suckers, we have all these 28,000 American military personnel in South Korea. We're paying for this, the United States. We're suckers, we're protecting South Korea. And General Brooks tried to educate President Trump on this and took him over to Camp Humphreys, which South Korea had built as a joint base, a massive base in South Korea, tripled the size of the initial base there. South Korea, as you know, paid $10 billion for this. This was 92% of the cost. When General Brooks told this to President Trump, said, well, why didn't South Korea pay for it all? Brooks explained that there was sensitive communication equipment that by American law had to be paid for and controlled exclusively by Americans and American contractors. Brooks explained to President Trump that South Korea over the last 15 years had spent $460 billion, that's almost $500 billion, to defend themselves, and they overflew part of South Korea, and Trump was in a very in a sour mood about all of this, and they flew over the Samsung operation there in South Korea, and Trump said, we're paying for all of this. And General Brooks tried to say, look, the alliance between the United States and South Korea is one of the best alliances we have. It makes all the sense in the world. And Trump wasn't buying it at all at that point. Trump then gave a speech to the National Assembly. An economy 40 times that of North Korea. Then, in a very belligerent way, President Trump said that the United States had 3 aircraft carriers loaded to the maximum in the area, very threatening to North Korea. He said we have nuclear submarines appropriately positioned. So this is the belligerent, dangerous period Trump had with believe, one of the great alliances in the world and has been very effective since the 1950s when the war didn't end technically, but there was an armistice. And so all of this is going along, and then the South Korean National Security Advisor visited the White House. Trump wanted to meet with him, and the National Security Advisor from South Korea, as you know, and I'm sure reported, told the president that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was willing to meet with Trump. Trump just said to Chung, go out and announce it there at the White House, and that was done. Very unusual to him. And Trump announced he would meet, that he would meet with the leader of North Korea. Big headlines, very astonishing moment. Then that set in motion the diplomatic phase, where I did 19 interviews with President Trump for my book Rage. We talked a lot about Kim Jong-un and North Korea and South Korea, and Trump told me that Kim Jong-un said he was totally prepared to go to war with the United States, that he expected to go to war. Trump believes by opening the personal channel with Kim Jong-un, he averted that war. Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, was told the same thing by Kim Jong-un, but Pompeo was much, much more skeptical about this and thought it was possibly a bluff, possible that there would not have been a war for a number of reasons, most of all that Kim Jong-un realized that his country could be destroyed by the United States and South Korea. So I was able to gain exclusive access to 25 of the letters exchanged between Trump and Kim Jong-un, which are astonishing. In one of them, Kim Jong-un says our relationship is like it's out of a fantasy film. He calls Trump Your Excellency. Trump said to me in one of our interviews in the Oval Office of the White House, said, see, he calls me Excellency. Felt that was really important. These letters have been analyzed by the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, and they considered the letters a masterpieces, flattering Trump, appealing to Trump's sense of grandiosity, Trump's sense of wanting to be at the center stage. And in one of my interviews with President Trump, I asked about the relationship with Kim Jong-un and the impact on South Korea, and what is really shocking about this, and it's in the book and it's quoted, that President Trump said the United States was allowing South Korea to exist by having this troop presence and of 28,000 troops and all of the other forces arrayed around North Korea. In my view, the idea that the President of the United States would say that, it's insulting. Certainly South Korea, as Trump has said, is an economic and military miracle, and to say that somehow what the United States is doing is allowing them to exist is quite absurd. So Trump had 3 meetings with Kim Jong-un. He actually felt that he got some concessions from Kim Jong-un. Others have been much more skeptical of that. In the first meeting, which was in Singapore, June 2018, Trump announced that he was ending the joint military exercises between the United States and South Korea, just unilaterally. And Secretary of Defense Mattis was taken totally by surprise. Mattis felt very strongly, as did the generals at the time on both sides, that you have to have exercises, you have to prepare, and you just don't let the troops sit around the barracks staring at the walls. What Mattis did, working with General Brooks and the South Korean military there, they really had a workaround order. The big spectacular exercises that would be visible to Trump and the news media were canceled, but they still did a lot of exercises with smaller units to make sure that they were prepared. In that first summit, Trump got a written agreement from Kim Jong-un that there would be complete it didn't happen. So in February 2019, last year, Trump and Kim met in Hanoi, and Trump said he wanted the 5 nuclear sites that Kim Jong-un had in North Korea given up. Kim said no, he'd only give up the first one. It was a failure, the summit was, and Trump still kind of thought, well, his relationship with Kim Jong-un is so important, so personal, that there would not be a war, and that somehow, after the first summit, Trump literally tweeted out, there's no longer a nuclear threat from the North. And of course, that's absurd. Anyone in the military knows that it's still there. Actually, North Korea has built more nuclear weapons. On June 30th of last year, 2019, Trump spontaneously said he was in the area and wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un at the joint security area that marks the line between North Korea and South Korea. They did actually meet. Trump attached great significance to it, told me that Kim Jong-un and the relationship Trump has with him is so solid that everything's going to be fine. In one of the letters, he sent Kim a 4-column picture which had been on the front page of the New York Times, and said, quote, "Chairman, great picture of you, big time." In other words, Trump believed and is acting as if he brings Kim into this public relations world that is so significant to Trump and defines much of his presidency. Now, in the book, in the reporting I did, I discovered, and in these 9 hours of interviews with Trump, at one point in February, he told me that the virus is airborne and that it's going to be worse than the regular flu, 5 times worse, in fact. Trump then publicly lied and said it's going to go away, don't worry, no concern. I thought in that February discussion Trump was talking about China because the virus was in China. It was not in the United States at that point in any way. And it took me 3 months to establish what happened. This is the luxury of time a reporter can have. And I was discovered in May of this year that at the end of January, and that this is the kind of pivot point in understanding how Trump failed miserably to control the virus in this country. On January 28th, in a top secret meeting in the Oval Office, Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, said to the president, "This virus is going to be the biggest national security threat to your presidency." Then the deputy national security advisor, Matt Pottinger, who had worked as a Wall Street Journal reporter for 7 years in China, had impeccable medical sources in China laid out for the president how his sources who knew what they were talking about and had evidence that what was coming, the virus was going to come to the United States. It was airborne, it could be transmitted human to human, that people who did not show symptoms actually could transmit the disease, have the disease, and transmit it. And Pottinger explained that instead of this being somewhat similar to what had happened in the 2003 SARS epidemic, what was happening was going to be much more in a significant, dramatic way, like the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic in the United States that killed 675,000 people. The message was clear, it was dramatic. Then a week later, President Trump opened up to me about what he knew. I thought he was talking about China, as I said. Then in March, the pandemic exploded. In another interview with President Trump, I asked him, "So why are you saying it's going to go away and not be a serious matter when it clearly is headed in that direction?" And the president said to me, he said, "Well, I like to play it down because I don't want to create a panic." This is a significant part of the tragedy of the Trump presidency. He did not realize or understand the people he led. I believe Americans, like South Koreans, when they're told the truth, don't panic, but step up like you did in South Korea to the nature and of the threat and developed a possibility. Let's see, in South Korea, there have been roughly only 400 deaths. In the United States, which has 6 times the population of South Korea, there have been 240,000 deaths, 500 times as much. The president failed and just continued to fail to mobilize the country, to fully mobilize, to create, as has been suggested, some sort of project like the project to develop the nuclear bomb in before and during World War II, the total collapse of leadership, and not only in the past, not from January 28th forward, but to this day, in November, December 2020, the president failed. I believe that the handling of the pandemic and the publicity about the neglect, the negligence on the part of the president had a significant impact on his failure to win re-election on November 3rd. That's being played out in this country and is a manifestation of how President Trump leads through denial, through not believing in science. President Trump doesn't believe in science. In fact, he launched a war against the doctors in the United States, as in excluded them from serious decision-making on this. And so we have a world that is in crisis, a country that is in crisis. We're going to have to figure out over the next weeks and months how Vice President Biden takes over. I think one thing will be clear, that Biden believes, because of his experience in the Senate for decades, for 8 years as President Obama's vice president, how important the alliances and how they are central to a strategic plan to protect the United States and its allies, including South Korea. I know some of those people, and I spent a long time interviewing Vice President Biden when he was vice president for Obama, and he's almost a national security technician. All of the years he's worked on relationships with countries like South Korea, European countries, allies all over the world. So I think there's going to be a kind of total flip once Biden takes office to how do we solidify and grow and establish new trust with our allies. I also believe that there will be some sort of plan to deal with Kim Jong-un that will be more sophisticated diplomatically, certainly will include South Korea. There will not be this bluster that we've heard from Trump about how he allows South Korea to exist, how he believes that the expenditure of money for the troops in South Korea and is somehow makes the United States suckers. I think it's precisely the opposite. I think that the United States is only, in terms of defense and national security policy, only as strong as its alliances. And yes, the America First, the Trump approach has existed for the last 4 years. I think it's been a very dangerous time for the world, for the United States, for South Korea, for Europe, for Japan, you name it. All of the Trump approach is impulsive decision-making, not organizing, not planning, not setting out long-term goals, and just doing it his way. And I think a great price has been paid. I also think that we're going to head back on a much more stable path. But it's not going to be instantaneous. And these fixes and the new approach are going to be complex. What's Kim Jong-un going to do? The relationship Trump had with him has disintegrated in a very significant way. And the love letters are, as best I know, are not being exchanged. So there probably is going to be some effort to work out some sort of diplomatic national security arrangement for the region involving China, Japan, South Korea, the United States. With North Korea, of course, the goal is to eliminate North Korean nuclear weapons. Very ambitious goal. The smartest people I know in the intelligence community think that Kim will never do that voluntarily. It's the source, one of the sources of his strengths in the country and in the world. It gives him power, he believes. So that's gonna be a struggle. What the policy is and whether there's ever some sort of agreement on the Korean Peninsula equivalent to the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama-Biden administration made, which Trump, of course, has torn up, whether there's some possibility of replicating that. So it's going to take months and years to stabilize that relationship. But in the spirit and mood, that's going to change quickly on January 20th when Biden takes office as President of the United States. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking to you and wish I could come visit South Korea again soon.
네, 고맙습니다. 밥 우드워드 부편집장께서 도널드 트럼프 시대에 미국이 가졌던 정책 방향 그리고 앞으로 도래할 할 새로운 미국과 국제 정세에 대해서 다양한 의견을 나눠주셨습니다. 다시 한번 감사드리겠습니다. 여러분께서는 2020 코라시아포럼을 함께 시청하고 계십니다. 유튜브를 통해서 많은 분들께서 함께하고 계시는데요. 감사하는 의미로 저희가 이벤트를 마련했습니다. 다음 발표 이어가기 전에 잠시 안내해드리겠습니다. 먼저 라이브를 시청하는 모습을 촬영해서 보내주시면 저희가 추첨을 통해서 백화점 상품권과 스타벅스 디저트 세트를 드립니다. 공식 행사와 특별 대담 그리고 세션 1부터 세션 4까지 함께 촬영을 해 주실 수가 있겠습니다. 그리고 오늘 저녁 11시 59분까지 인증샷을 발송해 주시면 되겠는데요. 코라시아포럼 gmail.com으로 보내주시면 되겠습니다. 뿐만 아니라 라이브 인증 이벤트도 진행이 됩니다. 실시간 채팅창에 올라오는 링크에 접속을 하셔서 조남과 연락처를 남겨주시면 저희가 선착순 100분께 스타벅스 아메리카노 모바일 쿠폰을 보내드릴 예정입니다. 그리고 포럼 진행되는 동안 퀴즈 이벤트도 진행이 되는데요. 퀴즈가 나가면 맞춰주시고 맞춰주시는 분들 또 저희가 추첨을 해서 선물을 드릴 예정이니까 끝까지 함께 시청해 주시기 바라겠습니다. 자, 그럼 첫 번째 세션 이제 두 번째 발표 이어가겠습니다. 아시다시피 이번 미 대선은 유권자들의 당파 분열이 심화된 정치적 양극화 모습을 보여줬지요. 민주주의의 상징처럼 보이던 미국이 분열된 모습에 다른 세계의 여러 나라 국가들이 우려를 표했습니다. 미국의 위기, 그 배경은 과연 무엇이고 또 정치적 평화를 되찾고 더 나은 선도 국가가 되기 위해서는 과연 어떤 방향으로 나아가야 할지 오늘 미국 대표의 싱크탱크죠. 미국기업연구소 AEI 대표를 역임하셨던 아서 브룩스 교수님을 모시고 얘기 나눠보도록 하겠습니다.
Hello, friends. I'm delighted to be with you here today for a special talk on what I think is very important for the fate of the world, certainly for the future of my country. I want to talk to you today about the policy and political crisis inside the United States. I want to talk to you how it relates to South Korea and to the rest of the world. Most importantly, I want to talk to you today about how I think we can fix the problem as the international community inside the United States for the good and for the peace of the world. I want to start by thanking 한국일보, a very well-known and internationally well-respected newspaper. It is my honor to be able to address those of you outside my country on behalf of this great newspaper. Many people in South Korea and around the world ask me, what's going on in American politics? It seems so strange, it seems so contentious, like everybody's fighting all the time. Why are Americans so polarized? They often ask me. Second question is more political. How did Donald Trump get elected? Now, I'm not saying that anybody watching this should like him or not like him, but it's a mystery to many people how he got elected. And finally, what can the United States do to become more peaceful as a country politically so that it can be a better world leader? Well, I'm going to seek to answer these questions today, and I'm going to try to do 5 things. Number 1, I'm going to talk first about how the world has changed in my lifetime. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how the world has gotten better since I was a child. Then I'm going to talk about how South Korea has shown the world how to go from poor to rich in just a few decades, how South Korea holds the answer for so many places in the world. Then I want to make the point that that is great, but nothing is perfect. I think that the improvements worldwide, including in the state of affairs in South Korea, has created a political and set of cultural issues inside the United States, and I'm going to show you why. Then I'm going to talk about how South Korea's success is actually leading in part to America's current political crisis today. And finally, I'm going to say what I think we need to do together as a world community, as friendship, as nations that are friends, to solve our problems and continue moving forward as democratic partners. So let's begin. When I was a child growing up in the United States, I grew up in a city called Seattle on the west coast of the United States in the 1970s. And in the early 1970s, I remember my first impression of real global poverty. I remember seeing a picture in the National Geographic magazine, which is a famous and important magazine in the United States, and it was a picture of children in Africa. Now, this is in the early 1970s when there was a terrible famine in East Africa, in Ethiopia, and it was a picture of children who were starving to death. They had flies on their faces, and they had big bellies. They were malnourished. It was a picture of world poverty, and it was designed to share with me as an American the fact that there were people all around the world who were suffering, and there was very little that we could do about it. Now, that had a big impression on me. It had a big impression on everybody my age, as a matter of fact. And I grew up, and I was under the conception, I was under the belief that nothing had happened to make world poverty more bearable, to make it better. I thought it was hopeless. Well, I was wrong. And a perfect example of that is what's happened in South Korea from 1970 until today. It's an extraordinary miracle. You see, in 1970, when I was looking at pictures of Ethiopia, South Korea was also a relatively poor country. Not as poor, of course, as Africa, but a relatively poor country. To be specific, in 1970, South Korea had a GDP per capita of $279, which is very poor. That's about $1,800 in today's dollars. It was about the same in the North, by the way. It was about $300 in the North. It was a little bit higher, but it was mostly the same in 1970. South and North Korea were poor countries, and it didn't seem like there was much that we could do about it. Well, I grew up, and I went to school and I went to work and I didn't realize something, that the world was changing around me. The world was getting better around me. Specifically, there was a miracle that was occurring, that 80% of the world's starvation poverty was being eradicated. Just as I was living my life, poverty was going down. There was an 80% decline in starvation level poverty from between when I was a child and when I became an adult. It was incredible. This is literally the only time in human history that poverty has declined. It is the greatest anti-poverty achievement in human history, and has happened in my lifetime and in the lifetime of most of you who are watching this speech. Now, perhaps it's more surprising to me because I grew up in the United States. You, most of you who are watching this, grew up in South Korea, and so you saw the actual miracle unfolding. South Korea is probably the best example in history of prosperity unfolding very, very quickly. Remember, in 1970, GDP per capita in South Korea was $279, $1,800 in today's dollars. Today, $32,000 per capita per year. It's incredible. South Korea has overtaken many of Europe's nations. South Korea has become a prosperous country, a country that's important on the world stage, a first world country in just a couple of generations. A poor country became rich in my lifetime. That's possible. And in fact, that was happening all over the world. Not as spectacularly as it happened in South Korea, to be sure. But even in Africa, people were being pulled out of poverty. And I didn't know that. For example, since 1970, actually since 1980 until today, life expectancy, the number of years that we will live, has increased by 15%. Just from 1980 until today, it's gone from 63 years on average around the world to 72 years. What a beautiful miracle that is. Infant mortality, the probability that a child will die within the first 2 years, has declined by 60% from 1980 until today. And literacy, the percentage of the population of adults that can read, has gone up by 23%. Now, of course, a lot of this is driven by the progress in places like South Korea, where life expectancy has gone incredibly high, that infant mortality is one of the lowest rates in the world, and virtually everybody has become literate. This is one of the reasons that prosperity has gotten so much better around the world. It's incredible. It's a miracle. You have experienced a miracle, and you're responsible for this miracle too. I'm really grateful for that. I'm amazed by that, actually. Now, people often ask, what happened? What happened since 1970 and 1980? Well, and sometimes we say, well, there have been great forces like the United Nations, which had all kinds of aid and programs. The World Bank, which made banking and liquidity and development easier. The International Monetary Fund, international transnational organizations. But that isn't the reason that people got so much better off in places like South Korea and around the world. It's not it at all. The truth is that there are 6 things that happened since I was a child that turned South Korea from a poor country into a rich country and lifted people all around the world, even in places like Africa, up. They are property rights, the rule of law, globalization, free trade, democracy, and entrepreneurial capitalism. Those are the forces. It was the laws that made it so, and the culture that changed, and freeing the markets and freeing people's minds. Now, that's so great. We should celebrate. But it's not perfect, because not every single country has enjoyed it. Let's take the case now of North Korea. In 1970, it was about $300 per capita, which is about $1,900 or so today, in today's dollars. Okay? What is it today? $1,300. $300. Per capita GDP has not increased in North Korea over the entire period that South Korea has gone from being poor to becoming rich. At the same time, periodic famines. They missed the global miracle. What happened in North Korea where they missed the miracle that happened in South Korea? The answer is they don't have the six forces. The six forces of property rights, of rule of law, of globalization, of free trade, of democracy, and of capitalism. They don't have those six forces, and that's why the country has remained poor. Now, sometimes people ask me, what about the People's Republic of China? What about China? Isn't China a good example of being able to develop and do amazing things without democracy? And the answer is, China has done wonderful things. China has made incredible progress. It's true. China has gone from one of the poorer countries of the world to becoming a middle-income country, between $5,000 and $10,000 per year per capita. So the question is, remember those six forces, one of those forces is democracy. Is it possible to make this progress without democracy? Well, let's look at that a little bit. Without democracy, you can develop and you can get out of the worst poverty. It's true. With globalization and free trade and some amount of capitalism, you can. But you can't become like South Korea. You can't become like Taiwan. You can't become like so many countries around the world that became democratic, because this is what we economists call a middle-income trap. You have to free the economy, but you have to free people as well. Why? Because only free people are creative. Only free people are truly entrepreneurial. You have to set people free so they can be creative, so they can take risks, so they can do controversial things. If you don't let them do that, you will be stuck in a middle-income trap. So it's wonderful what's happened in China, but it's incomplete. Only with democracy will China fully be able to instantiate, to live the miracle that's happened in South Korea. That's the secret to true prosperity, what's happened in Korea and other democratic countries around the world. So here, my friends, is lesson number one. Global free enterprise with democracy has been beneficial for the poorest people in the world. Don't let anybody tell you that it's only good for the rich. That's wrong. It's best for the poor. If you love the poor and you want to lift people out of poverty, you need democratic capitalism. It's a moral good. And as such, South Korea is an example for the world. Congratulations. Now, nothing comes without cost, as we all know. Everything good also has something bad. That's part of life. And I want to take you now from South Korea, I want to take you to Kentucky, which is a state in the United States. It's a rural state. It's a poor state. And I want to take you specifically to a little town in Kentucky called Inez, Kentucky. It's a town that probably you've never heard of. It's only a town with only a few thousand people who live in it. It's hard to get to. You have to drive for a long time. There's no airport. Inez, Kentucky has been poor for a long time. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson chose Inez, Kentucky as an example of a place that had American poverty, true American poverty, where people didn't have enough to eat, people didn't have enough work, people didn't have enough shelter, people were living in crisis. Why? Because Lyndon Johnson had decided in 1964 to declare what he called a war on poverty. And he needed to show Americans that there was real poverty in the United States, not just in places like Ethiopia and South Korea. He needed to show poverty in America to Americans so that he could launch a war on poverty and have public support. So he went to Inez, Kentucky, and on television, in front of the whole country, he showed the poverty and he said this, quote, "I have called for a national war on poverty. Our objective, total victory." He put in place massive social welfare programs paid for by the government. And since that time, we've never stopped those programs. We've only grown those programs against poverty. We have spent in the United States since 1965 $22 trillion. It's obviously a lot of money. So did we win the war on poverty? Let's look at the data. In 1965, when the programs were put in place, the poverty rate in the United States was 14%. 14% of Americans were living in poverty. Since then, we've spent $22 trillion to pull people out of poverty in America, and today the poverty rate is 14%, the same as it's always been. We have lost the war on poverty, not because people don't have nicer things. The truth is that almost every poor person in America has a television, has a telephone, has a refrigerator, has running water, has enough to eat. The biggest health problem among poor people in 1964 was malnourishment. Today, the biggest health problem among people who are poor is obesity. We've gone from one problem to another, but poverty has not been easier to escape. Relative poverty is something that's still with us, and that's a failure. So, what's going on in places like Inez, Kentucky that helps explain the fact that we still have entrenched poverty? Let's look at Inez and see what's happened. Over the years, as the world was developing in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and the 1990s, as South Korea was rising, the industries and jobs that were in places like Inez, Kentucky, started to change. They started to move. Most of the low-wage industries that were in places like Kentucky started to move to other countries. The natural resources were in different markets. The labor was in different markets. A lot of places like Korea were building factories, were getting international development because of globalization and free trade, two of the forces of prosperity. Later, jobs started to move and industry started to move to places like Indonesia and Guatemala, especially as Korea became a rich country. What did this mean? It meant that the whole world was getting richer, but certain people in the United States were not getting richer. In Inez, Kentucky, misery didn't get better. Misery got worse because it went from being a poor place with low-paying jobs to being a poor place with no jobs and welfare. Now, everybody watching me knows what happens when you don't have a job. The answer is you lose your dignity. Work brings meaning and work brings purpose for everybody, for rich people, for middle-class people, and for poor people. And for people in Inez, Kentucky in 1964, most of them were working. Today, only 29% of the adults in Inez, Kentucky are working. You have high rates of alcoholism, high rates of drug abuse, high rates of suicide. That's what happens when poverty stays and work goes away. And why did that happen? That happened because jobs left, and jobs left because of globalization and free trade. That's a big problem, isn't it? So these forces of prosperity that lifted up the world, that created the wonderful situation that we see in South Korea today, they weren't so great for certain parts of the United States. Now, this happened not just in Inez, Kentucky, it happened in places all across America. We found that from 1965 until today, the percentage of men between the ages of 25 and 64 not in the workforce. So working age men with good health who were not in the workforce, it was in 1965 about 3%. Okay, today it's about 12% of men. It's quadrupled in number, the percentage of men that are not working who could, permanently out of the workforce. A prime age man, a man between 25 and 65 who should be working, is more likely to not be in the labor force if he doesn't have a good education, if he's not married, if he's not an immigrant. One key thing that I want to bring to your attention is that some of the most successful people in America are immigrants. We need immigrants in this country. We need more immigrants in this country. We love immigrants in this country. I know that it sounds like we don't because of politics, but that's not true. Our culture is based on immigration. Immigrants tend to do very well. The problem is that if you're not an immigrant, you're not married, you don't have an education, you're most likely not going to have dignity because you won't have a job, and that will keep you in poverty. What will you say? Well, and you might think that immigrants are taking your jobs. You might think that globalization and free trade are bad things, of course. Now, one of the things that we find is that the percentage of men who don't work, who take illegal drugs, is 31% compared to 8% of people who work. 8% is too high. 31% is a national disaster. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that this is one of the biggest social problems that we have in the United States. There's a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Angus Deaton who teaches at Princeton University in New Jersey. And Angus Deaton and his wife, another economist named Ann Case, they've shown that between 1999 and today, that people without an education between 45 and 55, that the likelihood of dying is increasing. So for the first time in human history, mortality is increasing instead of decreasing in the United States, in the most developed country in the world, for a group of people that are between 45 and 55 and who don't have an education. There's 3 reasons for this: alcohol abuse, suicide, and drug overdoses. These are called, my friends, we call these deaths of despair. Despair because of idleness, despair because of a lack of work. And the lack of work, why? Because of the changing structure of the economy. The changing structure of the economy, that's the dark side of the wonderful blessings that have happened in my lifetime around the world. Now, on top of this, we had a terrible financial crisis in 2008. The financial crisis, of course, is always different than an ordinary recession. It happens less frequently, but it's a slow recovery. And there's a difference in income growth for a whole decade later. Specifically, what do I mean? That usually after a recession, every income group comes back in prosperity quickly. After a financial crisis, most of the income gains for 10 years go to the top 20% of the income distribution, which means places like Inez, Kentucky, still no luck. What's the political result of all this? Where people in places like Kentucky, around the world, around the country, who have low education levels, where they see their jobs going overseas. They see immigrants who are prosperous and they're not. They see a financial crisis where it seems like rich people are just fine and they're not. Well, the answer is that they're going to be more attracted to populism, to politicians who say, somebody has your prosperity and I'm going to get it back. Somebody who says that you should be afraid of foreigners. You should be afraid of rich people. You should hate international trade. You should be against globalization. And my friends, that's President Donald Trump. That's also many people in the Democratic Party in the United States today. That's populism. I've done research that shows just in the past 100 years across 20 advanced economies that when we have a financial crisis over the first 10 years, because of these dynamics that we're seeing in the United States, on average, you see a populist politician win at the end of 10 years. There's nothing surprising about President Donald Trump. He is a natural result of what we've seen since 1970 with globalization and free trade and with the peculiar special effects of the financial crisis. People ask me again, why President Trump? How did he get elected? And I will take you through the process one more time. Number one, the global expansion of trade changes our economy. Number two, people lose their ability to work and earn in places like Kentucky. Number 3, millions of people lose their dignity and they turn to drugs and welfare. Number 4, the financial crisis makes it much, much worse. Number 5, millions of people become sympathetic to the idea that foreigners are stealing from us and trade is bad. Number 6, Donald Trump and other populist politicians, they take up an agenda against trade and globalization. And number 7, if he's running in an election against an opponent who's not in touch with these problems, he wins. And that's what happened in 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump won 89% of the vote in Inez, Kentucky. Donald Trump, in point of fact, won the largest vote share in places in the United States that had the highest rates of alcoholism, suicides, and drug overdose deaths. Where people felt despair, they believed in that political agenda. And that's why we are where we are today. Lesson number 2. Globalization, which is good, but has different effects on different people. When you add that to failed welfare policy and a financial crisis, it marginalized whole classes of people across America. Donald Trump in 2016 was the only national politician who understood this, and that's why he won. Now, where do we go from here? Donald Trump has lost an election. We're in a new political time. There's an opportunity for us to turn our backs on polarization and populism, but we have to make the right choices. To begin with, we have to reject a peculiar choice. It seems to many Americans that we have a choice between poverty around the world and poverty at home. Why is there this choice, people think? Because when there was poverty around the world, there was prosperity at home with jobs. And when the jobs went away, the world got richer and parts of America got poorer. So therefore, people think we have a choice. We have to choose between a South Korea that's poor and a Kentucky that's poor. But that's what explains our anti-trade policies and our anti-immigration policies here. But that's a false choice. We don't have to make that choice. We need a new way of thinking, a new way of putting together policy and politics in the near term, in the medium term, and in the long term. So let's start with the near term. Let's start by getting rid of bad policies. Let's get rid of job-killing policies like trade barriers. Here's the great irony of the last 4 years in American politics. Just as national politicians said, I will put barriers in front of trade and tariffs, that will bring jobs back, it did just the opposite. The data are very clear that trade barriers and tariffs destroy jobs in the United States. And we need to get rid of these bad policies. Look, my friends, we can't turn back the clock to a time when South Korea was poor. We don't want to do that. It's a better world where South Korea and the United States are both rich countries working together. These changes, they're permanent, thankfully. Protectionism makes things worse for everybody, not better. So we need to first, in the near term, get rid of these bad policies to turn our back on these mistaken policies. In the medium term, we need to do something very important for places like Kentucky, and that is to modernize and improve our education system. When I look at the data on education systems, I don't see that the United States has the best education system. I wish we did, but where do I see the best education systems in the world? South Korea and Finland. The two best education systems, two rapidly progressing countries that are experiencing a lot of progress, which is great. We need to learn from other countries around the world and to invest in our population so that they have skills that are our comparative advantage, so that we can train people in the jobs of the future. We need to rethink our whole approach to education. When I visit countries like South Korea, like Germany, like Northern Europe, that have education systems that are working quite well, what do I find? I find that there's not just two classes of people, people who don't go to college, university, and people who do go to university. I find there's lots of ways to train people for skills and jobs of the future, and I admire that. We need a teaching system that's more modern, that teaches modern skills, including skills in advanced and flexible manufacturing, high-skill manufacturing that doesn't require a university education. Now, why don't we have that? One of the problems that we have is we have a highly bureaucratized and unionized teaching system in the United States. We need to change that. That's a big challenge for us in the United States, and that's something that needs to change for the benefit of our children, for the benefit of our future, and for the benefit of our population. In the medium term, in other words, we need, in the United States, an updated education system. In the long term, we need to remember our unique culture. One of the things I'm most proud of being an American is that I come from immigrants. I come from people who came from countries that were poor. My wife is an immigrant. My wife grew up in poverty, in a dictatorship. And now she lives in the freest country in the history of the world, in a country that showed the world how democratic capitalism can make everything better, in a country that has friends like South Korea that are showing the rest of the world as well. But we're forgetting our cultural values in this country by turning our back on immigration, turning our back on globalization, by arguing against free trade, by not being truly capitalistic in ways that we should. We're not entrepreneurial enough. We need to remember that the United States, it's a country based on faith, on family values, on hard work. We're a country based on personal responsibility. We're a country based on an openness to foreigners, a value for new ideas. We love entrepreneurship. We believe in self-improvement. These are American values that we've shared with South Korea and that we've shared with the world. But we're forgetting these values, and we need to get these values back. We need, in the long term, leaders, new leaders who understand these values and promote them with enthusiasm, with joy, who understand and promote these values with confidence. And this is lesson number 3. The American people don't need more welfare from the government. The American people, they don't need a closed economy without trade. We need a good education, we need the dignity that comes from work, and that we need a culture of hope. So here, once again, let me tell you the lessons that I take looking at the political situation today and the opportunities for the future. Lesson number 1, there's a huge amount to celebrate around the world. The world is better because of the countries that have followed the 6 principles of prosperity and have followed South Korea's successful model of progress for the future. Lesson number 2, nothing comes without cost. America's political crisis today is a result not just of the financial crisis, but of our own inability to adjust to a prospering world. Lesson number 3, if we want to fix this, we don't need more protectionism. We don't need more socialism. We need a better education system and a return to our unique cultural values. I am working for these things in my work as a public policy analyst and as a professor. I'm proud to work for these things. And this leads me to my concluding thought. Number 1, thank you for watching this talk. I hope you found it useful and I hope you found it helpful. But number 2, I especially want to thank my Korean friends for 4 things. Number 1, thank you for standing for democratic capitalism. Not everybody believes in it, but your life, your living, your prosperity is witness to how important it is around the world. Truly, our shared values are being shown to the world through your values. Second, I'm thankful to my Korean friends for being a beacon of freedom in East Asia. East Asia is a part of the world that's not always safe for democratic capitalism. We need countries like South Korea that people want to emulate, that people want to imitate. You're standing for democratic capitalism in a part of the world that needs it. Number 3, I want to thank my South Korean friends for your friendship to the United States, for standing by the United States, for believing in what we do, remembering that the important bilateral relationship with the United States helps keep the world safe. In fact, the world needs our friendship, and our friendship depends on you. And finally, I want to thank you for showing the world that progress is possible. When people say that progress isn't possible, that poverty is inevitable, I show them the example of South Korea. Your hard work, your personal responsibility, your enthusiasm, your hope, your optimism made that possible. I admire you for that, and I thank you for that. I'm Arthur Brooks. It's been my honor to address you today.
네, 따뜻한 말씀과 함께 정치적 양극화가 가져온 분열된 미국의 모습을 바로잡기 위한 여러 가지 방법들을 제시를 해주셨는데요. 실제로 바이든 미 대통령 당선인이 밝힌 소감은 영광과 통합이었습니다. 분열된 미국 사회의 통합을 촉구하고 또 갈등 치유를 첫 번째 과제로 삼은 건데요. 아마 이것은 비단 미국 내부만의 이야기는 아닐 겁니다. 이해 갈등과 파워 게임으로 혼란스러운 국제 정세를 과연 어떻게 헤쳐나갈 것인가? 바이든 당선인의 외교적 행보에 전 세계가 주목하고 있습니다. 그래서 이번에는 바이든 캠프의 외교안보 자문이었죠. 니콜러스 번스 전 미국 국무부 차관을 모시고 바이든 정부의 외교안보 정책에 대해서 조금 더 깊게 들어보겠습니다.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm Nick Burns, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and former American Foreign Service officer, American diplomat. I wish I could be with you in South Korea, in Seoul, but the pandemic prevents that, and so I'm very happy to address you by video. I'm looking forward to a good conference, and I hope that my remarks will help to shed some light on what's happening here in the United States. The first thing I want to say to this very distinguished audience is that this is obviously a very unusual time in the United States. We've had our election. President-elect Joe Biden has won the election with his Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. There's no question about that. There's no question in my mind that President Biden and Vice President Harris will take office at noon on January 20th, just a few months from now in 2021. But we're going through an unusual transition where President Trump is contesting the election. I think his efforts will fail. As we go through this transition, of course, the United States is conscious, I think all Americans are, that we have responsibilities at home. We have also responsibilities overseas and around the world. And that's what I wanted to talk to you today. What can we expect that the United States will do as priority issues in the next year or two? I think the first thing to say is that it makes sense that the United States, the American people, are going to have to take care of what's happening inside the United States first. As you know, we're suffering through a terrible pandemic. I know that South Korea is as well, although your record is one of the very best records in the world in coping with the pandemic. Here in the United States, we have 250,000 people that have died from the pandemic. That number could increase to 400,000 by February, March, April of 2021. There's no question, I think, that the new Congress, both Republican and Democratic parties, and the new president and his administration will have to focus on the pandemic at home. It's a true crisis here. Our federal government needs to step in and be much more vigorous in helping our 50 states cope with the pandemic. We're also suffering, as are all other countries, from a severe recession. It's hit the United States economy hard. There is a very high level of unemployment, of business failure. That situation could get worse before it gets better over the next few months. And there's a third crisis here inside the United States in addition to the pandemic and the recession, and that's the crisis of race. And if you've been obviously watching what's been happening in the United States over the last 3 or 4 months, you've seen a series of brutal murders of African Americans, sometimes by police officers. You've seen mass demonstrations, most of them peaceful demonstrations, where African Americans and white Americans and Americans of all colors and creeds have come together to argue for racial justice. If you put those 3 crises together, the pandemic, the recession, and the race crisis, I think our national leadership, our new President Joe Biden, our congressional leadership in both Republican and Democratic parties, they're going to have to focus first at home. But of course, the United States is a global power. We cannot succeed in the world if we're not active in the world. And I think the first thing that I would anticipate is that the United States under the Biden administration is going to rejoin the world and rejoin the global leadership table. President-elect Biden has said very consistently, publicly on the campaign trail, and he's repeated this during the transition that is underway, that the United States is going to rejoin the Paris climate change agreements, that we know that we have to do our bit to help the world combat the worst aspects of climate change and environmental damage. You'll see the United States back in the climate change talks. You'll also see the United States return to the World Health Organization, and President-elect Biden has made that a priority and said that will happen very quickly after he takes office. In the middle of a pandemic where every country in the world is experiencing terrible problems, it is absolutely essential that the United States return and work with South Korea and China and Russia and the Europeans and Japan and countries all over the world to try to curb the pandemic, to try to have greater support for the World Health Organization. And we hope that that organization can reform itself because it has not been perfect, certainly not in the way it treated China at the beginning of the crisis, but I think you'll see a much more active United States in the World Health Organization. And in general, I think the United States, which under President Trump has either isolated itself from the world in many respects or has acted unilaterally in the world, I think there's a consensus, certainly in our country now, the majority of people, that the United States needs to be a good citizen of the world and become active again in all of the alliances and organizations that are important for global stability, economic stability, political stability. So that's the second point of emphasis after the tending to problems at home. It's a return of the United States to global leadership, and that's felt acutely here by people in the United States. Obviously, as we think about the U.S. returning to global leadership, there's no question in my mind that there'll be a heavy emphasis on Europe because the European Union remains the largest trade partner of the United States. The European Union is the largest investor in the American economy, and NATO in the transatlantic region it represents the largest collection of American military allies in the world. I served at NATO as U.S. ambassador on 9/11 and at the beginning of the Iraq and Afghan wars, so I feel this profoundly, that Europe and NATO and returning to leadership in NATO and improving our relationship with Germany and France and the United Kingdom and other countries of Western Europe is really going to be a first-order priority for the United States. But having said that, there's no question in my mind, and I teach this here at the Harvard Kennedy School, that the Indo-Pacific, your part of the world, is going to become the most important part of the world for the world economy, for global stability, for global peace, and certainly as the United States looks at the world, the Indo-Pacific will, in the next decade, and the decade beyond that, and up to 2050, it will be the most important part of the world. Because obviously, if you look at global trade patterns and transport of oil and gas, it's the most important region in the world for the energy-producing countries of the Middle East to transport their oil and gas westward across the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal through the Strait of Malacca to the big Asian economies like South Korea. If we think about container traffic, it's the most heavily trafficked route in the world for surface container ships that carry a lot of the world's exports and imports. In addition to that, if you think about power, military power, well, many of the strongest military powers in the world are on that map of the Indo-Pacific: the United States, Japan, the Republic of Korea, your country, China, and India. And so it's really going to be the locus of military power in the world. And if we think of economic power, in addition to the European Union economy, the largest economies in the world are all on the map of the Indo-Pacific: the United States, China, Japan, India, and the Republic of Korea. And so I think many people now agree around the world that it's the Indo-Pacific from an economic standpoint, from an energy standpoint, from a container traffic standpoint, from a military standpoint, which is going to be the part of the world that is most important for global stability. We feel this acutely in the United States because, of course, we are an Atlantic country. I'm speaking to you today from Massachusetts, close by the Atlantic Ocean. So we face, on the Atlantic, we face east towards Europe, but we also face west. We're a Pacific country, as all of you know. Our largest state, our most powerful state, California, the engine of the American economy, is a Pacific Rim state. Washington and Oregon are Pacific Rim states. Alaska and Hawaii are in the Pacific. And so increasingly, as Americans think about our global strategy, we know we have to be involved in the Atlantic and in Europe, but we know that we have to step up and increase our involvement in the Indo-Pacific region. And I know that you know all this in South Korea, but I thought I should repeat it to this particular audience because I think it is going to be a major, major priority for the next administration and the administration after that. In addition to focusing on the Indo-Pacific, there's no question in my mind that the United States is going to have a new focus on our alliances. I talked about our alliances in the Atlantic world with Canada and the European countries in NATO, but we have priority military alliances, political strategic alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Our alliance with South Korea is one of the most important alliances we have in the world. The commitment that the United States has to the security and defense of South Korea from North Korea and from others is rock solid. I think the American public understands how important this is, members of Congress understand, and certainly I think the new administration will take very seriously the alliance responsibilities that we have with South Korea. And that means a maintenance of the American troop presence. I hope personally that we'll see a maintenance of the American troop presence on the Korean Peninsula, in South Korea itself. It means a very close strategic relationship between the governments in Seoul and the governments in Washington, D.C. It means that our two governments need to be strategically aligned. We need to be tactically aligned. We have to have constant communications between us to make sure that the alliance is solid and that there is effective deterrence against North Korea. That return to alliance is going to be very, very important for the United States. I know as a private citizen, as a college professor at Harvard University, that the relationship between South Korea and the United States has been rocky. It's been troubled. It's been unnecessarily, I think, tense over the last few years. I certainly believe as one citizen that we need to make every effort to shore up our alliance with South Korea, politically and militarily and economically. And I hope very much that's what the new administration and the Congress in both parties will do, because we know how important South Korea is to the future of your region, but also so important to the future of the United States. And of course, we also have to think about the North Korean problem and the North Korean nuclear problem. I actually felt that when President Trump in 2018 decided that he should negotiate personally with Kim Jong-un, I know there was criticism of President Trump for doing that. I actually felt it was the right decision, given the nature of the regime in Pyongyang, given the authoritarian nature of the government. There's only really one person whose views matters, and that's Kim Jong-un. And because the United States had never had a significant conversation with him until President Trump and Secretary Mike Pompeo met him several times, it made sense to test the proposition about whether or not we and South Korea could work effectively with Kim Jong-un. I think we all know what the result is. Kim Jong-un was not serious about those negotiations. He was not forthcoming on the issues that mattered to South Korea, to Japan, to the United States, to the United Nations. and the negotiations were a disappointment. But I do think President Trump was right to try. But now President Trump's administration, I think, has run out of ideas for how to handle Kim Jong-un. And it's my own personal view, and I worked in the Bush administration. In the second term of President George W. Bush, I was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and as you remember, our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and President Bush tried very hard through the six-party talks to try to convince the North Koreans to stand down on their nuclear weapons programs and to denuclearize. That negotiation failed. I was also a member of the Clinton administration. I was not working on the agreed framework of 1994. I was an advisor to President Clinton on Russia and Ukraine affairs, but I remember well that attempt in 1994 and 1995 with the agreed framework to try to have another agreement with the North Koreans. And so what does that tell us today? I think we do have to try diplomacy with North Korea. We have to see, it's my personal view, if the North Korean regime is interested and capable of undertaking productive negotiations over the nuclear issue. But what I would recommend personally, as a diplomat, as someone who teaches diplomacy and negotiations, is that if we begin anew with negotiations or with some kind of diplomatic initiative to think through how to denuclearize North Korea, there has to be very, very tight strategic understanding between the United States and the Republic of Korea, the government in Seoul, your government. And if I'm critical of President Trump on this issue, I don't think that he involved South Korea directly enough. I don't think he should have had one-on-one meetings with Kim Jong-un without President Moon Jae-in in the room. I think the United States and South Korea need to be very tightly together and seen by the North Koreans to be together strategically and tactically, so that any attempt by Pyongyang to separate the United States and South Korea would not succeed. That was the theory in the six-party talks during the George W. Bush administration, that the United States would be very, very integrated in its strategy with both South Korea and Japan, and that we would of course try to involve China in this effort as well as Russia, because those countries have influence in North Korea. But I think where we should begin, what I would advise, is we begin between Seoul and Washington. And we begin with an understanding between our two countries, we're all allies, that we're not going to allow ourselves to be separated in these talks, that any meetings that the United States has will be fully transparent to or with the South Korean government as we face North Korea. I would say the same thing about Japan. It's not as close to the problem as South Korea is, but it's very important for the Japanese to be involved in these talks. I think it helps South Korea and the United States to have Japan involved. And I think the most difficult part of this will be to try to convince the Chinese government that it needs to use its influence, its economic and political influence on North Korea, to push for change in the behavior of Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. We cannot accept a nuclear weapons force, in my personal opinion, on the Korean Peninsula. We should not agree in any way, shape, or form to a future that includes North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. We should do everything we can, diplomatically, politically, through sanctions if that's necessary, in a negotiation to convince the North Koreans to deconstruct their nuclear weapons platform. And I do think ultimately that is in the interest of China, and that is in the interest of Russia as well. So this issue of North Korea, of course, is going to be a major priority for the new administration, the new Congress in both parties. And it's an issue that I think begins with a strategic set of discussions between Seoul and Washington. That's what was missing in Donald Trump's policy, and I think it was a fatal mistake for the Trump administration to be so dismissive in some ways of the role of South Korea. From a wider perspective, it's going to be very, very important for the United States to be reconfirming its commitment to South Korea, its military and treaty commitments, and reconfirming our military commitments to our ally Japan, and reconfirming our military commitments to our ally Australia. The backbone of the American presence in the Indo-Pacific is with South Korea and Japan and Australia. It's also through our defense agreements with the Philippines, and that's a very difficult relationship for us that I hope in the new administration can be improved, and also with Thailand, a troubled country right now. And there's another country in the region who I think can be very helpful to South Korea, as well as the United States, and that's India. India is not going to be a formal treaty ally of the United States or of Japan or South Korea, but it's a very important strategic, political, and military partner. India, I expect, will stay non-aligned. That's been the Indian tradition since the birth of modern India in 1947. But we've seen the Indians change quite dramatically over the last 15 years or so, until the beginning of this century, the 21st century. As you remember, most of India's military technology came from the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation that succeeded it. But in the last 10 to 15 years, most of India's most important technology in the military sphere has come from the United States, come from Israel, come from some of the European countries. And the Indians, of course, have a major problem with China. We saw that this past summer in the conflict along the long border in the Himalayas between India and China. India very, very desirous to, of course, protect its territorial integrity. And we've seen it in the development of the Quad, which is a very important development in the Indo-Pacific, where the United States and Japan and Australia and India have come together in common cause. You saw in Tokyo just 6 weeks ago a meeting of the foreign ministers, including the United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, which I thought was a very positive meeting. My hope is that the Quad will deepen its cooperation in the military and political and maybe even in the economic realm, and that the Quad should begin to include other countries that are like-minded, and certainly the first country that one would think of would be South Korea. So I think this emphasis that the United States will reemerge, will embrace its alliances in the Indo-Pacific with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and others, to continue to build the Quad countries and extend some of those activities in naval exercises, air exercises to countries like South Korea. I think that makes sense for the United States. That's what I believe personally, and I think you'll see the United States be much more involved in the Indo-Pacific, including with the ASEAN countries at the ASEAN Regional Forum, and including certainly looking at the problems of the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I actually teach classes here at Harvard on the politics and the law of the South China Sea crisis and the East China Sea crisis. There's no question that China is violating international law in what it's doing in the South China Sea, in the Spratly and Paracel Islands. It has contested the sovereignty of the 5 other claimants to the Spratly and Paracels. It is making China extravagant legal claims to territory that it simply does not own under the Law of Sea Conference of 1972, using the 9-dash line, which actually came from the Kuomintang, from the Chiang Kai-shek government in 1947. The People's Republic now is claiming territory that is not theirs. I think there needs to be, obviously, a major effort by the countries of Asia, as well as countries like the United States, Pacific Rim countries, to continue to demonstrate to the Chinese that we will not accept their legal claims, that cases like the one that the Philippines brought at the International Court of Justice in 2016, that those cases have a lot of merit, that the ASEAN countries need support, they need political support. I hope that the United States, and I expect the United States, will continue its freedom of navigation exercises in international waters that China may claim, to demonstrate to the Chinese government and to the People's Liberation Army that the South China Sea is not the possession of China, that these are international waters largely, and that surface vessels, commercial vessels, military naval vessels, and in the airspace, both civilian and military aircraft have the right of transit and have the freedom to navigate through the South China Sea, both maritime and airspace. It's very, very important that all of us continue to assert those rights, because China is clearly pushing out and testing the resolve of the international community. The East China Sea, of course, as you all know very, very well, is a different type of conflict. There in the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands as the Chinese call them, the United States has asserted that the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty covers the Senkaku Islands. I think that's a very direct message to the Chinese government that any attempt by China, which I do not expect to happen, but any hypothetical Chinese attempt to infringe upon, by military means, the sovereignty of Japan, of course, comes under the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. That's a deterrent that I think the Chinese understand. And therefore, I do not expect any Chinese attempt to interfere with Japan in a military basis in the East China Sea, but still you have to continue, our country has to continue to assert our defense of Japan and also the rights that the Japanese have as the administrators of the Senkaku Islands. And last, I'd just say that, as you all know very well, Taiwan has become a particular issue. People all around the world concerned that the Chinese government, the PLA, might, in the next years or decade, attempt to subjugate the people of Taiwan through military force. This would be a great mistake. This would be a historic mistake by the Chinese government if it tried to do so. Taiwan has the right to live as a free democracy. It has a right to its own system of government. And Taiwan, as we've seen from the recent elections in Taiwan at the beginning of 2020, is a vibrant democracy, an active democracy. Taiwan is a very impressive economy. It's a world leader in many of the advanced technologies that are so important to the global economy. And I think it's increasingly very important for countries around the world to make clear to the Chinese government that the independence of Taiwan is extremely important to the rest of the world, that any attempt by the Chinese to subjugate the people of Taiwan would be met with mass political and economic opposition. And of course, for the United States, this is a very complex issue. We recognize one China, the People's Republic of China, but when we made that decision back in 1972, Congress also passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which gives the United States the right and indeed the obligation to help the people of Taiwan to defend themselves. And so you've seen over the years arms transfers by the United States to Taiwan. I think there's a great deal of sentiment in both of our political parties here in the United States that we should continue to sell and provide defensive technology to the people of Taiwan. So the Indo-Pacific, if we think about North Korea's nuclear problem, tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the alliances that the United States has with South Korea, Japan, Australia, our partnership with India, the complications of the South and East China Sea, and the complications of Taiwan, I think there's no more important region in the world right now, and none more vital for global stability than your part of the world. And that brings me to the relationship that all of us have with China. And I'll just speak about the relationship that the United States has with China. I said before that I thought that the Indo-Pacific was the most important region of the world for the United States. There's no question that the most important and also the most complicated relationship that the United States has in the world is with the People's Republic of China. We are the two world's leading economies. We're the two strongest military powers. I would say that the United States and China are the most advanced technology societies of the world in terms of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and biotechnology, the digital era technologies that are going to be so important. And for most of the last 41 years, we've had full diplomatic relations for 41 years. The United States and China, until very recently, had been largely engaging each other while also competing in certain realms. But we were engaging each other through the thousands of joint ventures that our companies, or tens of thousands that our joint ventures that our companies have together. We were engaging ourselves through the fact that there are 375,000 Chinese students at American universities, including at my university, Harvard, and that the interplay of China and the United States diplomatically, economically, politically around the world was one largely of cooperation, but that has all changed. That era of U.S.-China engagement, I think, is coming to an end in some ways. We're still going to trade with Japan. We'll still have students in each other's countries. We'll still have joint ventures. But the real the emphasis in the relationship has changed from cooperation to competition. And there's no question that both in both of our parties, the Republican Party here and the Democratic Party, there is strong support that we need to compete with China. And we're competing in 4 principal areas. First, we're competing militarily for strategic predominance in the Indo-Pacific, the United States having been the strongest military power since the close in Asia, since the close of the Second World War. China is certainly contesting America's military predominance by the development of China's Blue Water Navy, by the development of its sophisticated ballistic missiles, by its aggressive behavior towards the Philippines and Vietnam in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, its aggressive behavior towards Japan in the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands, China contesting the American carrier task forces that have been the backbone of the naval presence of the United States for the last 75 years since the end of the Second World War. All this is alarming to Americans, and I think there's a determination. I know there's a determination in the United States that we want to strengthen our military position. We don't want to see it weakened, and that gets back to the alliances that we talked about, particularly with your country, with South Korea and Japan. And so I think this first confrontation, this competition militarily, is a very important one. A lot of it has to do with the next generation technology, military technology that's being developed in the digital age as we see artificial intelligence militarized, or quantum computing used for military purposes, or biotechnology used for military purposes. This is a fierce competition between the two countries, or I should say between China on the one hand and America and its allies on the other. And this technological competition for military power is going to be very, very important. There's a second competition that you all are very familiar with, and that is China's refusal to trade fairly with the rest of the world. It's China's refusal to honor its commitments under the World Trade Organization on patents, on intellectual property rights. I hope personally that the United States will now respond to this challenge by working more closely with Japan and South Korea, and even the European Union, because together we're all free democratic societies. We are market economies. If we band together in the World Trade Organization and we insist that China play by the rules and adhere to the rule of law and stop the illegal theft of intellectual property, for example, that would be a very powerful combination. That's more than 60% of global GDP, South Korea, Japan, the United States, the European Union. President Trump's mistake, his great mistake among many that he made as president, was to pick fights, trade fights with South Korea, trade fights and tariff wars with Japan and the European Union and Canada, and he alienated our allies when he should have been uniting our allies, because we all have a variation of the same problem, and that's China's mercantilistic economic policies and the Chinese state's refusal to adhere to the rule of law in the WTO. So this second competition, which is all about economic rights and free trade and rules of the road, that's very important for your economy in South Korea. It's important for the economy of the United States. We ought to be doing more together. And the third area of competition, as I said, is in technology. China wants to be the global technology leader in artificial intelligence by 2025. China is using the enormous resources of the state, of the government of China, to give advantage to its own companies in competition with foreign companies. And I think all of us, and I think of the technology leaders in the world, South Korea is right there as one of the world's technology leaders, as is the United States. We need to be working together to make sure that we are developing the 21st century technologies that will power the global economy. And finally, I would say, in terms of the China-US competition, and I think South Korea is involved in this too, it's a battle over values. Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader after Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao to essentially assert very publicly and very aggressively that the authoritarian state system that China represents is a model for the rest of the world. He said that a few weeks ago at the end of the extraordinary political meetings in Beijing that led to really making Xi Jinping president for life, an end to the 10-year terms that the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of China held under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. And his assertion that the authoritarian way of life and authoritarian governments is a superior model, of course, is not something that we believe. It's not what South Koreans believe. It's not what the Japanese believe. It's not what the United States believes. It's not what India believes. It's not what Europe believes. And we should have the self-confidence to be making sure that we're contending in this global argument, that we're present, that we're making the argument for democracy, the rule of law, market economies, fair trade. That's a very important public debate for us to be involved in. The final thing I want to say about the U.S.-China relationship is that I think the most difficult part of it for both the Chinese government and the United States is there any balance between this highly competitive phase that we clearly are in and some elements of cooperation? Because I certainly do not believe that we're going to see a decoupling of the global economy where China and the United States cease to trade. I don't think we'll see that. Or China and the United States separate the world, in effect, into two blocks. I think the global economy is too complicated. It's too highly integrated for anyone to think realistically that decoupling is even possible, much less desirable. But I do think it's important that as we compete, and I certainly support this tougher, competitive American viewpoint towards China on the military issues and the economic issues and the issue of democratic values that I've talked about, at the same time, we have to cooperate with China on some issues. Certainly, we ought to be cooperating on the pandemic. I would hope that the United States and China could be working together, and they really should be working together with South Korea, because your country, your government has one of the finest records in the world in its response to the pandemic. We ought to be working with Japan and the European Union and Brazil and Nigeria. So I think that's where the US and China can work together on the pandemic. We certainly can work together on climate change. You'll remember that it was President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden working with President Xi Jinping. That was a big part of the movement towards the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015. And I would hope we could work together with the Chinese on that. And finally, there are other issues where we can work with China, stabilizing the global economy during this very serious global recession. That means the G20 should be working together. South Korea, Japan, China, India, the United States, Brazil, the EU, Russia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. We've all got to be in this together in aligning our fiscal and monetary policies so that the world economy can make a rebound, hopefully after the vaccines have been distributed. Hopefully when the pandemic comes to an end, we can refloat the global economy, return to manufacturing, return to prosperity, and in both of our countries, working with China is essential. So I think there has to be a balance between the highly competitive nature of our relationship with South Korea and cooperation. I think you have to probably give more of the balance to competition, but we Americans have to be careful and make sure that we're talking to the government of China and are cooperating in those limited spheres, but they're important, that I talked about. So there's so much that I think we could say. I wish I was there in person. I wish I could meet you all and we could have extended conversations about this. I do want to say, as a way of summarizing, there's no question in my mind that we Americans need to return faithfully and energetically to global leadership. No question in my mind that we will do that, certainly under Joe Biden's leadership, and I think this is going to be supported by many members of Congress. The United States has to return to global leadership, to involvement in the world, and the first place we have to do that is with our allies, our treaty allies. These are the most important countries in the world to the United States, to our future, and I would begin with South Korea, and just reaffirming that South Korea is a valued ally, the continuation of our military relationship, our economic and trade relationship, our political partnership is going to be very important for the United States going forward. I wish you all well for a successful conference. I thank you for inviting me to give these personal views. I'm here not as a representative. I cannot represent the new administration. I'm not part of the Biden transition team, but I'm someone who obviously is paying attention to global politics, and I have my background as an American Foreign Service officer, and I'm confident that better days are ahead for the United States and South Korea and for the world with this new administration coming into office in the United States of America. Thank you for listening to me today. I appreciate it very much. I'd be very happy to be in contact with you by email or perhaps in a future video session so that we can have a conversation about all these issues. Thank you so much for listening to me today.